Today is a great pleasure to welcome to our class on meditation, volunteering, and cultivating positive neuroplasticity offered through the Oli Osher Lifelong Learning Institute here at Cal. It's a great pleasure to introduce and have a conversation today with Dr. Stephen Porges. He is the author of the Polyvagal Theory, a theory and research that has revolutionized the field of psychology and the treatment of autism, trauma, and it teaches us a lot about ways that we can become more conscious of our own responses when we feel in danger situations or in life threat situations. He has published 300 peer-reviewed articles in journals, and he is the author of several books. This Polyvagal Theory is the one that was published in 2011, and it collects his research. It archives or documents his research on polyvagal theory as applied through many different fields of psychological regulation to high-risk infants, new insights and adaptive reactions about the autonomic nervous system, a totally new understanding of the autonomic nervous system and the importance of the vagus nerve. And then later on, he published a book also with Norton, the Pocket Guide to Polyvagal Theory, the transformative power of feeling safe. And that book is from 2017. I love this book, like many of the books in the collection of interpersonal neurobiology, the Norton series on interpersonal neurobiology, which was founded by Daniel Siegel, another wonderful speaker that we have had here in our course. I love this pocket guide because not only it has a definition of important terms referring to the polyvagal theory, it also has a wonderful introduction about the neurobiology of feeling safe, and that's written by Stephen Porges himself. And then there is a series of conversations of Dr. Porges with other psychologists about different applications of the polyvagal theory. We are going to hear in a moment more about what the polyvagal theory is. Different applications within the field of psychotherapy, and also within the field of how we could understand better some of our reactions when we are in difficult situations. For example, how polyvagal theory explains the consequence of trauma on brain, body, and behavior. Well, this book is still more accessible than the polyvagal theory, and it's still mainly directed to clinicians, to psychologists. Then we have this baby that just born, polyvagal safety. Attachment, communication, self-regulation. It's within the Norton series also on interpersonal neurobiology. And it's wonderful. It has chapters also on the importance of stillness, chapters by Dr. Porges on how the COVID pandemic has challenged our nervous system, and understood that from a polyvagal perspective. It has chapters on the connections between some yoga practices, especially breath, and the polyvagal theory, and especially for people who are understanding yoga in the traditional sense of classical yoga, which is this understanding of the connection of body, mind, and spirit, how some of the practices understood from that perspective are also responding to the same understanding of polyvagal theory, which shows us the connection between the responses that we have through our autonomic nervous system and our mental states, emotional states, capacity to communicate with others. And what can we do about it when we are in the midst of the situation? So this is a great book. I very much recommend it to you. And now we're going to have Dr. Stephen Porges himself talking about polyvagal theory with us. I also want to add that for me, discovering the polyvagal theory, it has given me a new understanding of some processes that I have gone through as a trauma survivor. And it has finally helped me to understand that my body was not failing me when it has erasing from my hypothalamus or from my capacity to remember 2 whole days of my life when I was under life threat situation. And I had tried to recover the memories of those days, and I can't. And I just couldn't understand why my body, which in general responds very well to all the practices that I have been doing about energy and embodiment and meditation, wouldn't go there and allow me to see what had happened. I just have information before the 2 days. Some people that were in the context told me a bit of what happened during those 2 days, and then the time at the hospital. But what I understood finally is that there are some parts of our autonomic nervous system, especially the vagus nerve, that as a mechanism of survival and protection, create a disassociation, and even more than that, a state of forgetting, with reference to that part that my body and whole organism just would probably not be able to process it. The body wisdom comes and says, look, this is not something for you to process. We are going to keep this in the being lost. There won't be any memories from that. It also has helped me understand why, when in other situations, not now of life threat, but of danger, of feeling attacked, and like, for example, if there is a shouting match or something, and I'm there, or things in a discussion that are said in a more strong, emotionally charged way, I have a hard time remembering what was said. I mean, I try, but somehow it doesn't come in. I mean, I hear the noise, but I can't have my mechanisms of understanding and learning and remembering to be active at the same time that my body goes in a partial shutdown, not now of totally forgetting, but somehow some kind of close down to understand what was going on. So all this and more, it's more accessible to understand now that I know about the different parts within the vagus nerve, and how the dorsal vagal, all this part of my vagus nerve, has the capacity not only to shut down and to forget, but also to temporarily dissociate when feeling under threat. And I have also learned how can I calm myself down in that situation, and how to have compassion for my own processes that are happening at that time, and even for the processes that the other person might be going through as they are in that fight. I guess it's not flight, it's fight response of their sympathetic nervous system at the time when they are feeling perhaps under threat themselves. So it's a little bit of a long presentation, but I just wanted to bring into everyday terms some of the advantages, some of the wonderful applications that the polyvagal theory has in our ways of relating. It also has a lot of juxtapositions with yoga and common ground with yoga, with classical yoga, in the sense of understanding the organism as a continuation of body, mind, and spirit. The polyvagal theory, what does is it shows us the physiology, the responses that are happening in our nervous system in many of the situations that sometimes we need to regulate ourselves and co-regulate with others. But without further ado, I am now bringing to our conversation Dr. Stephen Porges. Thank you so much, Dr. Porges, for your accessibility and for being today with us. Thank you. So, okay, so we can start now with relating the polyvagal theory to the contents of this course.
The title of it, just focusing on the title. Mm-hmm. Without knowing anything about your course, it's really a course about polyvagal theory, because it's a course of connectedness of one with society and touching others, just through different dimensions. The product may be neuroplasticity, but that's not the critical one. The motivation, the engagement with others is what polyvagal theory is about. It's about the need, the biological imperative of being a social mammal, being a human, is to interact with others. And if we start even thinking about who are the resilient people, they're the ones who have a sense of gratitude for being and a desire to interact with the world, to give things back, not to take. Because when we are under threat, what do? We want to protect. That's when we need our own stuff. But when people are generous, they're really not generous because they think they need to be, but generous because their body enables them to. So we're going to make a distinction between our feelings and our actions. And the healing process, or post-traumatic healing, is when feelings and actions start becoming closer together. And so what you're doing, what your description was, the freezing, the immobilization, was a separation of what the body was doing and what your higher brain structures would like you to do. And when we get into those states, there's really a damaging sequence to that. And that is, we tend to get upset with ourselves. We tend to, in a sense, abuse ourselves and become the abuser who, in a sense, we're mimicking our earlier abuse. We are telling ourselves we're not good enough, we're not strong enough, we're not this, or we're not that. And all what I've learned through my journey within the world of trauma, and I didn't start there. I started there as basically a laboratory scientist, but I got invited into that world because theory gave a narrative, gave voice to those who had experienced severe trauma. And I listened and I learned. And so what the theory gave me a vocabulary to share with others that maps into their life experiences. Before I kind of go off and elaborate too much, let me just give some building blocks. I'll share the screen, and I have a few very basic slides. I don't normally like to use them in any interview format because it's a violation of the co-regulation that I like to have the talk walk the walk, meaning that if I'm talking about interaction and co-regulation, I like to do it. I don't like to, in a sense, push people off with PowerPoint, but I'm going to do that for a few moments, if you don't mind. So I'm going to share the screen and show a few slides. Okay, what is the autonomic nervous system? And I'm really, in a sense, assuming that most of you may have heard the word, but have not thought much about what it is. And basically, it's the nervous system that regulates the organs in your body. And in fact, when you go to physicians, they don't look at the neural regulation of those organs. They look at those organs, your heart, your lungs, your liver, your pancreas, and your gut. And if your body is under, in a sense, in states of threat, this is really what we're going to get at. This nervous system moves out of a homeostatic or a state where it helps your organs heal, helps them develop and rehabilitate, to a state that we would call chronic stress. And so when we are under threat, we don't service our body. We try to stay alive. It's an adaptive function. And under short terms, it's really remarkable, but long terms results in damage to the body. So what is this autonomic nervous system? And this is a picture of it. And, just keep alert for a few more minutes, and then we'll get into a more interesting dialogue. But basically, you may have heard the term sympathetic nervous system. It's a nervous part of the autonomic nervous system that supports mobilization. You may have heard of it as a fight-flight reaction, but the sympathetic nervous system is much more than fight-flight. It's where we get excitement, basic arousal, exuberance. It keeps us going. We like our sympathetic nervous system, and we don't want to think of it merely as a fight-flight system. It gives us the energy that keeps us going, alive and alert. And it's viewed in the world as this accelerator of our bodily functions, meaning our heart rate goes faster, we become more metabolically active. And opposing it is, in a sense, the biological brake, a parasympathetic nervous system, which is primarily inhibitory, slowing up the heart and reducing activity of other organs to offset the sympathetics. And the primary component of that parasympathetic nervous system is this enormous nerve called the vagus. And the vagus goes basically through your body into virtually every one of your visceral organs. And this is the way people are taught about. They're not taught about the complexity of and the nuanced function of it. They're taught about a autonomic balance, a brake, an accelerator. But if we look carefully, we see that there are two basic branches of the vagus, one going above the diaphragm, and the one that goes above the diaphragm not only regulates the heart, but the larynx and pharynx. And this means that the intonation of our voice is a flag, it's a signal to others about our visceral state. If our voice is melodic, our heart is calm. If our voice is high-pitched and monotonic, we are basically in a stressed out state. So we're broadcasting our physiological state in our voice, but also in our face, because the area of the brain that's regulating the heart and the voice is also regulating facial expressivity. And there's a second branch of the vagus going down to all the organs below the diaphragm. And this really is not totally acknowledged when people talk about the autonomic nervous system, nor are is the major component of the autonomic nervous system the sensory part. So on the vagus, 80% of the neural fibers are going from the body to the brain, and only 20 are going from the brain to the body. Basically, the vagus is our surveillance system, telling our brain, is everything okay down there? And when the brain gets information that things aren't okay, it tries to make those adjustments. But the interesting part about these two vagal components is that they have a different evolutionary history, different functions, and they evolved for different adaptive purposes.
Just one question.
Yeah.
What kind of adaptations does the brain do? So we have this vagus nerve that informs, it's a bidirectional thing where the brain is not just figuring things out, but it's receiving information from the body. And then you said it does some adaptations. Does it send more?
We'll see that in the next couple of
logical, but
you're going to see it when we go into the evolutionary stages. We'll see what it does, and that's going to come up, I believe, next. Okay, so the next point I want to emphasize is that the autonomic nervous system is an intervening variable. And what does that mean? It means that it's in between, it's our bodily state that impacts and biases how we respond to everything in the environment. So this bodily state affects our behavior, our emotion, and even our capacity to learn. And primarily in our world, our bodily state either interferes or facilitates whether we can interact with other people.
Right.
And when you have a traumatic event and your nervous system, quote, retunes to deal with defense, what's the thing that is most prevalent in a survivor of trauma? And that is this difficulty in social relationships, the difficulty in trusting and feeling safe in proximity of another. And this is literally the window that you see that is easily explained by the body being in a state that was very good for defense, but not good under conditions of safety and trust. In fact, it doesn't facilitate that. And in fact, when you talk to survivors of trauma, it's not that they don't want to have relationships and trust people, it's that they can't. And they will tell you that if they get into relationships, they push back. That's because their body says can't go there. So let's look at a few more.
You have a treatment for that, right? You have a treatment for.
Well, we have a strategy of a treatment for that.
Okay.
The strategy, in this sense, what we're really saying is this is the important part, what's in the middle. And what traditional mental health strategies were about talk therapy or telling people, don't let it bother you. And, I used to say if talk therapy worked, there'd be no depression, because why would people want to be depressed? You tell them, don't be depressed, and it works. And we use those approaches even with developmental disabilities. We try to tell autistic individuals, make eye contact, be social, rather than looking at what physiological state they're in. If their bodies are calm, sure. But if their bodies are in states of defense, social behavior is not even an option. And so when your child doesn't want to go to school and their stomachs are hurting them, it's a flag. It's telling you that their body's in a state of threat. And what do we tell our children? You should go, you have to do it. You'll get over it, you'll like it. We're not listening to their body, and we're in a sense sending a bad signal to the child, and we're telling the child, don't listen to your body. And this is really the history of contemporary illness, or illness in the contemporary society, that is turning off our surveillance system of our own organs, in a sense overriding the feedback that says something's wrong, this isn't right for you. It's fine to do this for short periods of time, but you need to be nourished by play and by social interactions with others. So this is the model that we want to keep thinking, and this is the portal of intervention, not the, in a sense, telling people or giving them drugs. Drugs do not effectively and efficiently change the neuroregulation of the autonomic nervous system. You can lower your heart rate, but you cannot very easily through pharmaceutical methods increase the neuroregulation. So it doesn't quite work in terms of the pharmaceutical model. And
that's what I love so much about your system, is that it's based on the wisdom of the body. So you are working to how to bring it back to some kind of balance and
let's take your comment. The model assumes that the core of being a human is remarkably wonderful on all levels. On a physiological level of supporting health, I'm talking in general, you can have genetically caused diseases, you can have injuries, but in general, the nervous system is promoting health if it's not in a state of threat. So what we need to understand is that the core, even the core of humanity, is being social, benevolent, and compassionate and generous, which I think is part of what your course is about. That occurs if the nervous system evaluates the world as being safe. And everything in our, I should say, virtually everything in our environment and in our institutions are structured regarding focusing on threat, evaluation in school, evaluation in the medical practice, evaluation, and our nervous system sees evaluation and assessment as a threat. And you can ask your children, you can even reflect on your own experiences of whether you invited or liked evaluation. So this becomes the model, but I want you to look at, if we're in different states, our body does, we're relaxed, we're spontaneously engaging others, we're smiling at people and they're making us feel good by smiling back. But when we're in other states, our facial muscles stop working, our voice loses its intonation, and we're sending cues to others that we're not accessible, and they're sending cues to us that they are not accessible to us. And our body gets, in a sense, into a fight flight, and we get into arguments. And we create narratives about those arguments. We start saying, you're not listening to me, you're not listening to my words. Well, that's obvious, but the words are not the major thing. The major thing is the intonation of your voice. Our nervous system cares less about the words and more about how the person is broadcasting those words. But given physiological states, different ones support calmness, growth and restoration, and social behaviors. Others, such as your sympathetic nervous system, supports fight and flight. And older, that subdiaphragmatic dorsal vagus, can also support defenses, meaning shutting down and disappearing, just like a reptile. If a reptile is under threat, it may immobilize or go under the water and stay there for a couple of hours because they have small brains. Their bodies can literally shut down, reduce the massive metabolic demand that sympathetic nervous system would require, and just stay there until predators may leave.
I like your example that we are descendants somehow phylogenetically connected with the turtles, and we just kind of go down, but that state of immobilization can also be fatal if it's taken to extreme.
That's the problem, that unlike reptiles that can go there whenever it's necessary to survive, humans can't go there. And when they go there, they fall, they pass out, they defecate. And they can it can be lethal. If you're a preterm baby and you go into that state, you get clinical bradycardias and you're dead. So the issue is the nervous system can go there, but it's very dangerous. And I believe what happens is you go there once, and then the nervous system gets smart and says, well, you shouldn't shut down all the way. We'll give you a little sympathetic tone so you don't fall, but now you freeze, you don't move. And so there's a degree of alertness. And then if this continues, the abuse continues to go on, the nervous system may do another remarkable adaptation and say, look, just dissociate, just go someplace else. And so I see this as a continuum of different nuanced adaptive reactions. But let's think about what happens when we get shifts in autonomic state.
Before there, just one more thing. You were talking about the social component more here than the sympathetic nervous activation, fight, flight here. And then you use some terms like dorsal.
Those terms, thank you for bringing me back to reality. Ventral really means the front side of the body, and the ventral vagus comes out of the brainstem in the front of the body, and the dorsal vagus comes out in the back part. But those are different areas in the brainstem, but they both exit through one conduit called the vagus. So when we think of cranial nerves, or in this case, this magic nerve, the vagus, it's really not a good way of thinking of it as a unified nerve. It's much better to ask what pathways are going through it. It's a conduit. And some of the conduit is coming from an area in the front part of the brainstem and some from the back. The old stuff is from the back, and the old stuff still goes to our gut. And so if people who are here today may feel that, like if they get really upset or someone shames them or upsets them, or they've lost a loved one, they'll feel it below their diaphragm. They'll feel it in a way that triggers a life threat reaction in their own body. So
bring also problems with the digestion and
we will get into that, because that's the world we're in. And then if we were to do a poll of any group, we find out based upon their symptomatology, we would know exactly what's going on. So with irritable bowel syndrome, digestive issues, cardiovascular, these are viewed as if they are separate, unique disease states or diagnostic entities, but they are frequently, I mean, really frequently, comorbidities of mental health issues, or let's say cultural societal issues. I don't even want to call it that affect mental health. I don't want to give it a disease entity. The point is mental health and physical health are health. It's an integrated health system. And when we disrupt our homeostatic function, then we get mental health problems and we get physical medical problems.
So for homeostatic function, you mean the inner balance, everything in the autonomic the system, the immune system, the endocrine system?
Yeah, I use, when I even talk about the autonomic nervous system, I mean an extended autonomic nervous system. That includes the endocrine, the immune, the inflammatory systems. They're all interrelated in the brainstem. They're talking to each other. So when one goes into a state of defense, the others are as well. So inflammation, autonomic dysregulation, endocrine imbalance, they all are going together because the body has lost its capacity to regulate and organize its function. The ventral vagal circuit, this newer vagus, is a remarkable brainstem unit because it seems to choreograph the rest of the autonomic nervous system, because it's the system that conveys cues to itself and to others. So in a sense, constrains the sympathetic and that older vagal circuit it constrains it from going into defense. And now when we mobilize with this ventral vagus on board, we are playing, we are moving with social behavior. And when we shut down and we have the social engagement system on, we call that shared moments of intimacy. So it means that this ventral vagal circuit is our toolkit that enables us to enjoy the riches of a full life. And for people to think about this, so we think about what do shifts in autonomic state do? If they move towards that newer vagal pathway, it supports social behavior. If you support social behavior and calming, you are supporting learning. But what happens when the system moves into a sympathetic fight-flight or starts to shut down with that older vagus? Your social awareness is not accurate anymore. It's all biased for survival and defense. And this interferes with the processes of sociality and learning. And when you disrupt your autonomic state, you change the threshold to that you yourself will have to express disruptive behaviors. And in a way, you create a different neural platform that supports distraction and hypervigilance and not compassion, not co-regulation and engagement. I have a couple more.
Before we go there, just to somehow make a bridge with I mean, I love the way you are explaining this, and just to make a bridge. So you are saying that, well, I forgot it. You are saying that when you talk about the ventravagal, so we are talking about the part that has to do with coming from the brainstem, and mainly from also the area of the eyes and whatever is influenced by that, the inner ear, and then that's connecting with the heart. And that was the part that you were talking about, socialization or play. And that when it goes into this regulation, is more about fight flight, it's excitement, turn, defensiveness. And then the other part that you were talking, the dorsal vagal, which is the older part that comes in the back and that influence the organs under the diaphragm. That when it's good, it goes into a kind of relaxation
and digestion,
intimacy, digestion, etc. And when it goes out of balance, it goes into closing, shutting down.
The system is sensitive. So what you find, of course, with people who have trauma histories is they often have diarrhea and constipation. Their gut isn't working right, because the gut has not gotten the cues that it's safe to function. And that's that homeostatic activity. This picture will give you another way of organizing the information. The older dorsal vagus comes on board about 500 million years ago in terms of the evolution of vertebrates, organisms with backbones. The sympathetic nervous system comes in about 400 million years ago. These are very old systems, but that ventral vagus comes in as mammals emerged from asocial, extinct, primitive reptiles. So it was a repurposing of the autonomic nervous system to turn off defenses, because what are mammals? Mammals need connectedness. They need to co-regulate. All our society, the history of humanity, is dependent upon the ventral vagus. It's literally an emergent property, and that is that we were able to turn off our defenses to be safe in the proximity of another. And to do that, that ventral vagus that turned off that metabolic activity evolved in a different area of the brainstem, literally the area of the brainstem that regulate the organs above the diaphragm in mammals, took a journey in embryology to the area of the brainstem that regulated the facial muscles. So our ventral vagus is married, intertwined with the regulation of the muscles of our face and head, which means our voice and our face broadcast our physiological state. And that's the way that our nervous systems of mammals were able to functionally socialize and support each other. Think
So
of
it wasn't the survival of the fetus, it was the survival of the
well,
it's
an interesting. It's interesting because this circuit functions well enough at birth for a full-term baby for a newborn to appear to be smiling, even though it's not necessarily a voluntary smile. So in a way, a full-term baby seduces the parents into loving them. It's really interesting to watch. And when you have a preterm baby whose neural regulation of the facial muscles and vagal regulation, the heart, isn't functioning, parents have great difficulty in attaching. And there's been a tremendous amount of work about how to enable parents to understand that their preterm child is still an individual. A lot of lessons about uniqueness and sensitivity and reactivity. But if we go back to when I started my research, and we're going back decades, preterm babies were abandoned in the hospital and became wards of the state because the parents at that time were not allowed literally to touch the baby. And they would come in a couple times, and over a while they end up with a narrative, that's not my baby, I'm not attached to it, and they'd leave. And this was relatively frequent. The issue is not only has medical care improved in enabling more preterm babies to survive, it's also gotten wise about what it is to be a human, and that is human interactions aren't necessary for the body to thrive. And it's really, the story is remarkable, but the trajectory of preterm babies, of course, you can survive under 30 weeks gestational age. And when I start my work, 30 was really a good point. And that's when that ventral vagus starts to myelinate, starts to work. So you see the risk occurring, the greatest risk occurring when the ventral vagus hasn't really developed. And the other part is when you have babies who are more premature than that, their suck, swallow, and breathe circuits aren't developed. And the suck, swallow, and breathe circuit is the same circuit that we use for socialization. And that's why we say, let's go out for a drink, let's go out for a meal. And I always like to say that our social engagement system, the ventral vagus, is social, but the digestive process is personal. And that's the subdiaphragmatic vagus.
So wonderful. I love that your study with premature babies, and a lot of which is also in this one, has made you so compassionate about these needs that we could see on the other person when it's going through problems or whatever, like a puppy or like a whatever. Realize, okay, at this moment they are being like partially hijacked, or their physiology
just bring a puppy into the room. In fact, there's a group in Toronto that brings babies into classrooms and uses that as the major intervention to bring more compassion, more benevolence into the educational model. And it works. So, but this is kind of now a summary of what that phylogenetic. Phylogenetic is really like saying, what's our own evolutionary history? And the evolutionary history of our autonomic nervous system really has 3 stages. We, our ancient vertebrate ancestors had this primitive unmyelinated dorsal vagus.
Sorry to interrupt you. Can you explain unmyelinated?
Oh yeah, myelin is a coating, is a fatty substance, but don't think of the actual physics of that coating. Think of an insulated cover going on a wire. So what it does, it's an insulated cable that enables signals to go more rapidly and more specifically. So when it's myelinated, when it's unmyelinated, it's a little slower, I would say a little sloppier, and doesn't have the precision. So as the nervous system evolved, certain fibers to do certain jobs became myelinated. And it's interesting that the vagal regulation of the heart is myelinated, and likewise the bronchi. But the older vagus is not. And think of that as still affecting in us fainting, shutting down, dissociation. So that circuit is being brought in. And the next system is that sympathetic one, and that supports fight, flight, but it also supports mobilization of all types. And finally, we have in our mammal world, we have this newer vagal circuit, and this supports social communication, and social communication and co-regulation support our biological health. And this is an important point because it means that we in our own body have to elevate the importance of sociality as a neuromodulator. I know you've talked a little about neuroplasticity, but neuromodulation is the regulation of our own states. Neuroplasticity is not state, it's saying the structure has changed. Polyvagal theory emphasizes that we can shift states, and sometimes we get locked into states that don't do the best for us in that setting. So social communication allows us to move into a state that doesn't require defense. And so and regulates our physiology that will promote health, growth, and restoration. I think, this is the last slide, and this was to put the theory into a visualization. And that is, we have a nervous system. That nervous system is detecting cues of safety and cues of threat, where all the previous vertebrae from whom we evolved have only a neuroception of threat. Mammals not only have a neuroception of threat, but they have a neuroception of safety cues. The neuroception was a word I invented because if I'd used the word perception, we'd be blaming each other for not perceiving. And we do this already. We say, why weren't you aware? Why weren't you perceiving it? Our nervous system makes decisions outside of our awareness. And I had to coin a term. It's like a startle reaction. Startle reactions are neuroceptions of potential threat. So when we hear loud noise or hear a gun go off, or at times fireworks, and if you carry trauma histories, low frequency booms can really set your body off a lot. So you have a heightened awareness of predator type sounds. So this neuroception is how our nervous system interprets the detections of different stimuli. So when you were doing the preamble before I talked, you were using words, I think, like perception. But what we want is, perception has a valence to it. It means I've interpreted it. And we want to, in a sense, be more agnostic and say our nervous system detects at the most primitive levels. And at higher levels, we make meaning out of what we detected. But our threat reactions, and even our reactions to safety, often occur without any level of awareness. So when we feel disarmed in the presence of a super co-regulating, a person who walks into the room, their voice is prosodic, their faces are glowing, and we are like this, we don't even know what's hit us. But Our nervous system does, because this is what it's looking for. And if you want to practice and you have a puppy or a cat, practice with the intonation of your voice. And you can see the dog or the cat. If the dog was on the back like this, then you're good. You're giving the cues of, it's not that you're overwhelming. The dog is saying, I'm so safe, you can touch my ventral side. And again, the ventral side is almost reflexively guarded. So when we think of what is the visualization of someone being in a state of defense, it's this. If you look at autistic kids, they're doing that. So our nervous system is making a distinction without awareness of whether cues are safe, dangerous, or life-threatening. And if they're safe, well, it turns on that ventral vagal circuit in the social engagement system. And now we can spontaneously look at people, make facial expressivity. Our voices have intonation or prosody, and that supports our health, growth, and restoration. And if we get cues of threat, our muscles get more tense. We send our sympathetic nervous system gets energized, and we're ready to flee or to fight. But if the stimulus is interpreted as being life-threatening, meaning overwhelming, our nervous system might just shut down. And death fainting of a mouse in the jaws of a cat is the perfect example. And the issue of death fainting is often other cues like confined environment and low frequency sounds. So I think we're now ready to have our time.
Okay. Well, I'm sure there must be also questions from our participants, and maybe you can put them in the chat and we can integrate them here. Yeah. But I have some questions for you. Like, there is a lot here about co-regulating together. What about being alone? Like, for example, some of us live alone. Some of us also have been quarantining alone, or for whatever reason, the person lives more alone than in company. How does all this
okay, so
polyvagal theory?
Yeah. So let's start off by saying it would be nice if people had safe, trusted relationships, but we know that's not possible because some people have attempted that and their history has been they've been hurt badly, and their nervous systems have retuned. But their nervous systems still need cues of safety. And this is the point. How do you get the cues of safety? Pets are very, very helpful. People, especially even during the quarantine period, people have used their dogs and their cats, and it makes a big difference. For me, I have my wife and I are in the house, so it's not a question of being isolated on that level, but we're isolated from the community. We still aren't interacting that much, but we live oceanfront, and so we live in nature, and the sound of the waves, the breeze, the trees, the birds really helps, and the rhythmicity of it is very comforting. The other part for me, and this is part of what I learned experiencing the pandemic, was video conferencing. And because it's not the same as having a cup of coffee, but it's not bad. So it gets me, I view it as my social experience for the day, that I'm engaging, I'm meeting people, I'm learning about them, there's a dialogue going on. And so, but the bottom line in all this is I really would like to share is that I have always viewed myself as kind of a social person, not having any social anxieties about talking or meeting people. But the pandemic has changed me. So my autonomic nervous system has been retuned because I'm bombarded with the threat of being an older person, the threat of being infected, and also, I would say even more than that, the behavior that I've seen on television of others that have been so disrespectful of individuals' vulnerability. And so even though I used to fly a lot, I'm very hesitant about going into the airport and being confined on a plane. When you start hearing about people being outrageous on planes and they have to be taped down with duct tape on the flight, I just don't want to put my body into that type of risk situation.
Yeah, I saw in this one, it said that when you started creating the book, I think it was in March 2015.
It was the week, it was the last time I left the house, really.
Yeah.
Was when I was meeting with Norton. I gave a
And
talk in New York.
2020, March 2020 and March 5, 2020.
Yep, that's right. I gave a talk on that Friday, and that Saturday I went out to dinner with people I knew, and there was a table of 8, and by Monday, 5 of them had COVID, and we were on a plane going home. So I felt that I walked through fire and survived that, but it was, yeah, it was in New York City, and I had no idea that how virulent that it would be, especially in New York, which at that point was the epicenter.
Okay, yeah. So we are starting to have some more questions in the chat, and I had another question that had came before that was saying, it seems that this is very, we have been talking about how important it is for the treatment of trauma and how it helps trauma survivors to make more sense and co-regulate. And the question was, how about addiction?
Interesting issue, because the people, first of all, on the website, on our Polyvagal Institute website, which is our new not-for-profit, we have affinity groups setting up, and over 600 therapists have, in a sense, coalesced, come together in an area that is called Polyvagal Theory and Addiction. And they're going to have their first national meeting next year. So in a sense, they're self-organizing. The reason is that virtually everyone, and virtually, it's always dangerous to say everyone, but let's say the vast majority of those who have addiction problems have a trauma history. And so you don't separate the two. You have to respect that in the treatment of an individual, you have to, in a sense, tread carefully, because the trauma history creates vulnerabilities for treatment of addiction.
And how, can you tell us some of how?
Yeah, we're actually involved with discussing with various groups, including one out in the LA area of addiction center, about since certifying it as being polyvagal informed. And that is that it starts adhering to the principles of polyvagal theory, start focusing on physiological state, measure heart rate patterns, use the acoustic stimulation that we develop for calming, and be very aware and respectful of the physiological state of their clients. And so it becomes a journey of psychoeducational journey in which the client, the one who's recovering from addiction, becomes a better student of their own body. And that journey includes a personal experience of honoring what their body does, as opposed to being angry at their body.
Thank you so much for that. And you mentioned passing the treatment, the sound safe protocol. Could you tell us a little bit, and maybe we can tie that to a question from one of our students who is asking about what is he saying about the low sounds and the process or emotion sound.
Let's start with answering the question specifically, and that is, why are low sounds threatening? It's actually how our nervous system evolved. It's where thunder, it's the mechanicals of buildings that people get very upset with. It's vacuum cleaners with autistic kids, trucks, where jet planes, people in general, if they have a trauma history, or if they have any feature, like with autism, of an autonomic nervous system that has been, in a sense, tuned to be more threat oriented, low frequency sounds are very disruptive. And part of that occurs that when the nervous system is, quote, retuned to be defensive, the structures of their ear, and this is now middle ear structures, change. So when the structures of the middle ear, they're little bones in the middle ear, and when they are tense, the eardrum gets tight. When the eardrum is tight, it's like a kettle drum, the pitch gets higher, meaning that low frequency sounds bounce off the eardrum. When the bones become limp, or the nerves and the muscles don't create this tight chain, the eardrum becomes flaccid, and now low frequencies permeate into the inner ear, and people can't hear human voice. And they're going to be, since we're talking to a group that has some mature people in it, the issue is we as mature people see it as difficulty hearing what people are saying in bars or in restaurants, and we withdraw. But part of that is aging, and part of it is also the middle ear structures are no longer efficient and effective in literally facilitating that those low frequencies bounce out. Most of the acoustic energy in our environment is low frequency, but most of us can still hear human voice well because we have sufficient neural tone. So you can be both hypersensitive to sound and simultaneously hyposensitive to human voice. And that used to be viewed as a paradox, because they used to characterize autism, and people used to say, well, they're not attending. They don't want to listen. We have to break them through that shell. But really, it was the transfer function. It was the physics of how their ears were working. So the Safe and Sound protocol was an intervention that I developed, initially focusing on children who had auditory hypersensitivities and auditory or voice hyposensitivities.
Could you explain that thing about how hyposensitivity, because I don't think many of us.
Okay, so when the bones and the nerves and the muscles are not tightening that ossicle chain, low frequencies come in and they basically overwhelm the acoustic environment, and that makes you hypersensitive to sound because you're in a sense affected by it. But since the low frequencies are dominated, your brain cannot extract voice because the energy, the sound volume, the actual decibel level of the background sound is so many decibels more than voice. Voice is not high energy. It may appear to be high energy, but it's really not. The background sounds get dampened.
So we are talking about having difficulty to listen the human voice.
So it's not, again, this becomes our orientation, which is so much structured towards intentionality. So why aren't you listening? Well, maybe my neural structures of my middle ear are preparing me to deal with predator, with danger. And now I'm very equipped to deal with danger, but not very well equipped to deal in the classroom to follow verbal instructions. And you have a lot of those situations. And you also have that, in a sense, with aging, where people don't want to go into social settings because they can't extract the human voice from the background sounds. And so they withdraw. So so what I try to do was, could I rehabilitate the system? And I basically was using a treadmill model. And that is, you take modulated sounds that we know trigger the system in healthy neurotypical individuals, and which is like a mother calming her baby, the modulated voice. I take that paradigm and I amplify in vocal music. The intonation changes. So I basically amplify prosody. And so I'm really saying the body can't say no to this. And over a 5 1-hour sessions, I basically, it's like a treadmill. I increase the range that the ear has to deal with. And with the autistic kids and children who had hypersensitivity, it works extraordinarily well. The interesting part was what happened when they tried it within the trauma community. And within the trauma community, it had this, what I call almost a paradoxical effect. Then people would listen, their bodies would become accessible. But if you carry a trauma history and you get the feedback that your body's accessible,
right,
it prompted massive anxiety and mobilization. And with that, acknowledging that, the insightful therapist said, this is fantastic. What we can do is titrate this, allow the nervous system to get familiar with it, go very slowly, and see if we can resolve this. And they've been very successful. So they're using many of the, actually within the area of somatic experiencing, I think they're well over 100 of their providers are now using the Safe and Sound protocol, and also with EMDR. So they're using it as an adjunctive therapy to change the state of their clients, to calm them down so they can do their work better.
Okay, little bit by little bit, titration.
That's
and
right.
then since you were talking about trauma treatment and anxiety, there is another question about, are there also applications in treating non-traumatic anxiety and depression? And how about self-help? And then what would you recommend, which is something that we are trying to do in this course, how to work with ourselves to move forward.
So one of my colleagues, Deb Dana, who is a psychotherapist, I'm not a psychotherapist, and Deb has actually written several books on applying polyvagal theory in the treatment of mental health issues, not just trauma. But what she does is take this physiological centric perspective. She doesn't really want to know about the actual event that is bothering you. She wants to know where you live in your body. What is the state that you're in? Can you feel the state? Can you move in it? And so if you were to think in terms of like your history in yoga, and part of the yoga practice is the awareness of the bodily states that you're going through. It's not merely a mechanical practice, it's a practice of embodiment. She's taken polyvagal theory and basically used it for a journey of re-embodiment.
Right. What's beautiful also that, in yoga and in Qigong, which comes from China, we have this understanding of the continuity between the body, the mind, and the spirit.
Yeah.
And so it's very much similar to polyvagal, because polyvagal is saying, hey, don't just think about the mental or the emotion, find out what's happening with the body, what's the body telling you. So I think there is a lot that can be learned bringing polyvagal to the yoga practices and back and forth, and mindful movement too, and stillness within the movement, which is part of what Qigong does. Because it allows, people sometimes have trauma and they cannot sit still. So things like meditation don't really work for them so much, but maybe slow movement with a sense of stillness, that would work better for some of them.
So the interesting thing is you're in describing, listening to you, you're actually providing examples of what I call diagnostic issues. So I basically say, well, how do you interpret stillness? Is it that state that you want to be in, or is it a state that you're really frightened of because you feel if you're still, you'll disappear, go into the abyss? And of course, if you have trauma histories, people don't want to be still. They don't want to go through that, because immobilization is the worst thing. It moves them into that shutting down state. So often people with trauma histories use literally a polyvagal principle, and that is that the stages of the evolutionary stages reflect a hierarchy of how our autonomic nervous system works, which means as long as you move, you can't shut down.
Right.
And actually, you can actually, if you talk or know people with severe trauma histories, that's how they adapt and function. And they may appear to be workaholics, they may appear to be highly anxious, and what they're telling you by their actions is they can't afford to immobilize, because they'll dissolve, they'll disappear.
And here is where it touches with the wisdom of the body and with us being kind to our own processes and also listening, right? Because sometimes we just work for hours and hours and hours and we just don't keep listening. This body needs to move, or, so many other clues. So there's, sorry.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I started to use a different metaphor. I would start to say we're an enslaved species, but we're enslaved now to basically mental visualization. We're not honoring our body. We can, in a sense, we're so conscious of ourselves, and we know that we can turn off our body signals and work for a while. And we say, I can work for even longer. I can work for even longer. And pretty soon the body learns that those feedback loops that keep us alive, keep us healthy, keep us exuberant and happy are turned off. And then we start getting mental and physical ailments. And we don't understand why. And we go to doctors and they basically say, can't find anything wrong, it must be in your head. That's where it starts. And then it ends up in the organs. So there's a trajectory of progress, and that is a disregard for what our bodies truly need, and a disregard that our evolutionary journey was to be a social species. That's who we were supposed to be. And I'm not basically saying everyone needs to be socialized. I'm saying the species as a species evolved to do that. But many of us may have retuned autonomic nervous systems. So being social now is disruptive to our nervous system, just like, as I was telling, listening to the Safe and Sound protocol. If there's a severe trauma history, it can be disruptive, and you need a very competent therapist to work with you on those situations.
In this book, The Baby That's Just Born, you also have a whole chapter on how has COVID and this communication, because it seems that meeting through computers and Zoom and whatever is part of our present and future, some ways of still communicating, but taking some precautions for not getting infected, etc. So what suggestions or recommendations do you have so that when we are communicating through Zoom or this thing, it doesn't become another form of isolation, but in fact we start getting some of the clues of, of our communication that helps us to
so for me, the first thing is to realize that when I'm on Zoom, that's all I'm doing. I'm present with you. I'm not doing my email while you're talking. I'm here for you, you're here for me. That is a physiologically different process than most of us we're used to in terms of using two-dimensional videos. We view them as entertainment or let's say work, but not as an interactive component. We had our smartphones, or we had something else that we were doing, or big screens, or another monitor to do our email while we're listening. The first issue is the involvement in the interaction. The second part for me was to be able to see the upper parts of people's faces. Now, today I didn't move my camera. My camera's up high. I don't like that. I'd much rather be eye to eye, but my laptop is a little unstable and my camera is on a 27-inch iMac. So it doesn't quite have the same authenticity that I would like. But I started to, before COVID, I did not wear glasses on Zoom, but maybe my eyes have deteriorated, which I think they have. But in wearing glasses, I can see the person, I can see definition in the upper part of the face. And that to me means a lot, or means a lot to my nervous system. So I started to create the structure. The other thing is I need the house or the environment where I am in to be quiet, because if I hear noises outside the room, then the neuroception of well, you call it danger, but it's just disruptive to me, and it breaks my thought, breaks my contact interaction. So I'm trying to build the context that enables as much of a social interaction that I would have in the real world through the virtual world.
Thank you. Thank you. We have a few more questions. One of the questions here, it says, is the audio track available to the public or for purchase?
Oh, the issue is it's not available to the public. And this is an interesting personal journey. I developed this material and didn't know what to do with it, because I saw how profound it was, especially with children on spectrum. Several of them no longer were on spectrum. So
what does it mean to be on a spectrum?
It means carry a diagnosis of autism. So this is a story. This is when I was a faculty member at the University of Illinois Medical School in Chicago, and a psychologist from another medical school in the vicinity had a his son was about 8 or 9, and he came into the program and he had a tested IQ of 70. And he did well within the program. It was 5 one-hour sessions, that was it. And then that was the last I heard, except he tried to get me to deliver more of this because it was working for him and he didn't want to lose this stuff. Now, what happened later was a year or so later, I contacted him because I needed some other people on an advisory board because I was doing work in an school for autism. And I thought it'd be nice if someone, some of these people that I thought I was helpful to. Well, he said to me, he says, my son has an IQ of 140 now, and he is we moved schools so no one knows that he had autism.
Wow.
So the father was not very helpful, but basically was saying this is something we do not want to divulge because he's a bright kid doing well. And this isn't the first one that happened. It doesn't mean that you cure autism, but it tells you that many individuals who have the diagnosis of autism is because they can't regulate their physiological state and they're being overwhelmed by the sensory world that they're in. That first slide, autonomic state, sensory, stimuli, responses. Their autonomic nervous system is in a state that's defensive. Stimuli end up being, in a sense, in a reactive world. So in this case, you see that you can change it. And over the, I think it is now 5 years, over the 5 years, 6,000 people have been trained. And so some people have licenses for a short period of time and then go back and forth. But it means that it has impacted on tens of thousands of people already. And if you want to have a sense of gratitude, or for me to have a sense of gratitude, is to know that my work has impacted on others. It's just a thrilling bit. And through our interactions, we are putting all kinds of interesting assessments on their dashboard so that the providers can now have more objective tracking of what's happening to the clients. So I anticipate that we'll have a database in the tens of thousands of the effectiveness and who it works well on. We're doing pilot work on Parkinson's. We're doing work on clinical disorders like Ehlers-Danlos, which is joint hypermobility syndrome. We're seeing what this can do and whether it can actually calm the body down. Can it be used like an acoustic vagal nerve stimulator? So rather than just thinking of auditory hypersensitivity, think of it as, can I calm the body down? If I calm the body down, what happens next?
Beautiful. I know we are a little bit over the time you have given us. Do you have time for 1 or 2 more questions that are in the chat?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay.
Listening to one of the YouTube talks, and you mentioned how the body wants homeostasis. We want to feel safe. And it made me think about people that live in their own little bubbles. Maybe, I mean, in our polarized nation, people are afraid to go out of the way they think to experience somebody else's way of thinking or seeing things. So it's, I didn't know how that related to a true sense of homeostasis.
Okay, I think you're hitting on something that is extremely critical. And so the fact that people are basically angry and not listening, very poor witnesses, is really a reflection of the physiological state they're in, and they're promoting the physiological state in others. We're in a sense, the politics of the US at this moment is a threat-based politics. And because it's not a cooperative problem solving, which is what our nervous systems want. We want cooperation. We do not want aggressiveness. And so when you see people getting angry and you're really seeing their physiological state being manifested in their behavior. And once they get that mobilized, they're not good witnesses. Their capacity to listen to another is greatly compromised. So as intelligent, educated people, we tend to think that we can make an argument and people will be convinced. I think the issue, like with the vaccinations, is really another one of the examples. So people have very strong feelings, but they can't be convinced one or the other. They have strong feelings, and those feelings are all based in their interpretation of what the threat is based on the information that they have listened to. So they don't want, in a sense, a dialogue. They basically want to be witnessed. And the issue is there's power in listening and witnessing. We have to train ourselves to be better listeners as opposed to evaluation. Remember what's going on. When I said earlier, evaluation is a flag to our nervous system of threat. And everyone feels like they're being evaluated.
What's very beautiful is that that also reflects on interpersonal exchanges, how we can honor our feelings in feeling I'm disagree, but I don't have to act on it.
Yeah.
I can still have compassion for the process that I see unfolding in front of me. In the other person, find the vulnerability that they have with the state under threat. Or
what I try to do, and I use the word try because I try it with those who are in proximity to me. So I try to say, don't go into a narrative. Feel how you're feeling. Don't label it, describe it, honor the feeling. You don't need to get into a justification of why you feel upset or why something's bothering you. If you start building that narrative, you'll never get out of it, because what you're doing is creating a top-down that thrives on the bottom up. And I'm saying, can you stop it? And can you appreciate what your body's telling you without creating that narrative? I'm not saying this is easy, but the first step is don't explain why you feel a certain way. Experience that for a moment. Functionally learn from your own feelings.
Mm-hmm. Talking about top down and down up, in yoga, for example, when we do meditation or in meditation, in mindfulness meditation, etc., that state of somehow relaxing and feeling also the connection with others, just going beyond that threatened self that feels very much like isolated and separate.
Yeah.
Would that provide some kind of form of integration and healing?
I think, I would talk about it as another facet of co-regulation, facet of connectedness. That when we feel connected, we are basically abstractly co-regulating. I was very affected by the videos I watched yesterday on these individuals who had survived really amazing, basic horrible situations, about their whole desire, about a gratitude of being alive, a smile on their face, and the desire to give back to the community, to share, to give whatever they could give. They weren't there saying, oh, my life's been horrible. They were saying, I'm a happy camper, I'm alive, and what can I do to make other people's lives better? So you could see that nourishment coming in the back and forth, but it was this connectedness with community and desire to have a connectedness with community. Some people call it faith, some people call it gratitude, some people call it compassion. But I also think the concept of compassion has at its roots a level of connectedness with other.
Right. And it can come from active practice or from moments of great peace. Because another question here is about meditation,
Yeah, I think, so let's talk compassion for a moment. I think people think that compassion is a learned experience. And I think that gets it all wrong. It's the emergent experience based on that physiological state. If you're not safe, then the compassion is not compassion. The actions aren't compassionate. You may try to operationalize whether generosity or giving, but it's not the same. The body has to feel safe. Spirituality is the same thing. If we're not safe while approaching spirituality, it becomes religiosity. It doesn't really, it loses its embodiment. So I'm saying compassion is an embodiment of connectedness with others. And so is spirituality, but it's not with others. It's with something larger.
Beautiful, beautiful. It reminds me of what Dan Siegel says about compassion is integration in practice.
Yeah. Well, Dan's a good friend. He didn't get that from me, and I'm not sure I got what I said from him, but we cross the stage frequently together. So.
Yeah. Here's another question. Is fear of public speaking distorted social awareness?
Fear of public speaking is the body being in a state of threat, and anyone who has fear of public speaking knows that. A colleague of mine, I was actually giving a talk at UCLA, and this was about 15 years ago. And the person who was going to introduce me said to me the night before a party, she said to me, she says, I have tremendous fear of public speaking. I'm frightened about introducing you. And I basically just smiled and said, don't worry about it. I'll fix it. So the next morning at 10 minutes to 9, and 9 was when the conference started, and I was the first speaker, she comes up to me and she said, Steve, fix it. So so I looked at her and, taking the challenge, and I realized that she was making very short exhalations. She was huffing and puffing and saying one word per breath. She was working herself up into a frenzy or getting very anxious. So I said to her, extend the duration of your phrases, add more words before you take a breath. Extend your exhalation, but do it in a functional way of more words before you breathe. She started, it was very hard for her. At first she couldn't do it. And then another word, 2 words came in, then 3, then long phrases. And she went up and did a great introduction. She was engaged with the audience and interactive. And now, as a clinical psychologist, she uses it to treat people who have fear of public speaking. So I feel very proud to have given her a tool that she could use for herself and help others. But it's a yoga practice. It's like slow exhalations increase the vagal activity. It makes it incompatible with being anxious. It's recruiting that ventral vagal circuit. So whatever we call it, we're doing that, and that's containing the sympathetics. And now we appear to be exuberant because we haven't turned off the sympathetics, but we've contained it. And now we project a very exuberant introduction to other people.
Beautiful. Something that we do in Qigong and is that there is a point at the level of 4 finger breaths under the navel that's called sea of energy. And that's a point that has to do with self-doubt and confidence and all that. I was in a conference with a colleague, and he was about to give a presentation, and they were doing a discussion just before that. He was so nervous, and I said, just put your hand here and breathe. And the hand was at the navel here. And after a while, he was totally calm and went up. So your story reminded me of that.
Yeah, well, in our discussion yesterday, I want to get reconnect because I would like you to teach me some of these breathing manipulations.
Oh, perfect. Yes, I'm so...
Or at least experience them. I'm not sure I would be a good student, but I could still learn a little.
The important thing is to try, yeah. Thank you so much.